we're joined today by, there's some MPs in the room, MP staff, and many 38 Degrees members. Just to start with a quick apology, there was a last-minute change of room and time, and I know there was a little bit of confusion, so again, apologies and thanks for bearing with us and still joining us. So we're all here to discuss issues around data sharing. When the news broke back in May that HMRC were considering changing the way in which it manages our tax data, over 260,000 38 Degrees members rallied behind a call to HMRC not to sell or share our tax details with private companies. This is based on kind of two key concerns that came through very strongly in that. The risk to our own individual privacy and also a lack of faith in the ability of HMRC to anonymise our data in a way that protected us. So to talk us through these plans, the potential issues or even maybe benefits associated with them, we're joined by a wonderful panel here today. We had invited Lynn Homer, the Chief Executive of HMRC, but she and they declined to join us on the panel. They've offered a meeting to 38 Degrees and Open Rights Group after this, so we will ensure that all concerns represented here are shared directly back to them. So joining us on the panel today is David Davis MP, senior Conservative MP who really cares passionately about the issue of privacy. He's worked with 38 Degrees before on the so-called Snoopers Charter. So thank you for joining us, David. We've got Professor Ross Anderson, who's from the Cambridge University Computer Lab. He's a Professor of Security Engineering who's carried out research into all areas of data and privacy. So he's here to share his wealth of knowledge on this subject. And we have Jim Killock, who's the Director of Open Rights Group, which are privacy and data campaigners active in the UK and all across Europe. And they've been working very closely with 38 Degrees on this campaign. And just to introduce myself, my name's Maddie. I'm from 38 Degrees. So the structure, we'll just go to each panellist for 5 minutes just to share their thoughts before throwing it open to the floor. We're very busy in here and we are time bound, so just everyone make sure to keep questions and answers as concise as possible and respect everybody's time and willingness to contribute. So we're going to start with Ross.
Thanks, Maddie. As I'm the first speaker, I should set the background very briefly. Before the last election, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems both promised open data. They were basically put up to this by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who wanted the government to publish the Ordnance Survey map data so that people could compete with Google Maps. Instead, after 2010, Cameron hired as the transparency czar a guy called Tim Kelsey, who had previously run a health IT company called Dr. Foster's, and he set about, instead of making the government transparent, making us transparent. And the result of that is care.data, which many of you will no doubt have been following. In care.data, basically what's happening is that our hospital records have been sold off to over 1,000 different buyers worldwide, not just non-profit researchers such as academics, but also for-profit firms, drug companies doing scientific research and also for market research. Now, it was claimed that our health records, when sold off, would be anonymised, and this turned out to be not true, because the records had on them an identifier which for most of you contains your postcode and date of birth. So they simply just weren't paying attention. But even if they had bothered to encrypt this, it still doesn't work. Let me give you an example. Suppose you've got a database of all the hospital treatments of all NHS patients with an encrypted identifier. Well, all you have to do is go and look for the person who was treated for atrial fibrillation in Hammersmith Hospital on October the 19th, 2003, and there you have Tony Blair's record. So you then search for all instances of the same encrypted identifier across the database, and you've got all the other things that went wrong with him and for which he got treated in hospital or for which he got tested in hospital. That is a compelling example of what has gone wrong with this program, and the problem with the HMRC data sell-off is that it is a horse from exactly the same stable. They are trying to do the same thing all over again. There are even parts of the press releases, some of the terminology that we see being repeated. What they want to do is to take our tax data, which for most of us, I suppose, will mean our self-assessment tax return, perhaps competently, perhaps not competently, remove our name and address, and then make this available to hundreds, potentially thousands of buyers, many of whom will be in the city and interested in getting financial information on us so that they can do marketing, tailor products, and so on and so forth. Exactly the same risks will be there, so that if, for example, you were recently enough to sell a startup and you sold 723,000 shares of a company at 512p, and everybody knows that, then bingo, you're identified. And surely there will be many other individual circumstances that will enable people to be identified depending on how fine-grained the postcode information that they attach is. At our postcode, for example, there's only 4 houses, right? There's a couple with 4 kids, there's an old-age pensioner couple, there's a single guy, and there's our family. So everybody is pretty well completely identifiable, I think, from the tax code. That's the sort of thing that we face. Now, for this to be workable, there's a couple of options. One of the options is that you just publish everybody's tax return. Right? You know, so you not, they actually do that in Norway and Sweden and Finland. So you can make a case for that, publish everybody's tax return, and then you get a genuine version of the Sunday Times rich list. You can see how, not just how much Richard Branson said he earned last year, you can see how much tax he paid, which is perhaps even more interesting. Now, if the government wants to go down this route, then what I suggest is that they start off with a pilot project, because big IT projects tend to go wrong. And what they should start off with is by publishing the tax returns of all members of Parliament. Sorry, David. Including the House of Lords and Bishops.
You'll be surprised how cheap I am.
And all senior members of the civil service, all civil servants in grade 1, 2 and 3. And let's see how that goes for a year or two, and then let's take a fresh view after that. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ross. And Jim, shall I pass you this?
Thank you. So the Open Rights Group, we're a group of around 2,000 individuals who campaign on privacy and free speech. We have done so since 2005 and often work with both David Davis, Sir Jake Reed and Ross Anderson. We're all often on these panels making very similar kinds of complaints, and that's something I'd like to touch on today. In European and British law, we have a right to privacy, and this is very important to us because of the way that data use is changing. More and more data is created about us by companies, by governments, and that's just the nature of digital life. More and more records are getting created. And the way that we've tried to deal with this in law is to have the idea of data protection. Data protection law says that because you have a right to privacy, you should always be asked before data is gathered and used about you, and you should be able to choose whether that happens or not, so that you always have a right to say yes or no. The HMRC policy, though, would take that control away from you, because it is not saying you have consent, it's saying we use this data, we sell this data, and the kind of problems and risks associated with the use of that data that Ross has spoken about then become not your choice. They stop being your choice, they become the choice of the policy and the government instead. And even providing the idea of an opt-out doesn't really sufficiently work, because as you've seen in the care.data debacle, it relies on the idea that you can adequately inform everybody and that everybody understands the risks and the availability of that opt-out, and that those who are worried exercise it. And that is putting a huge burden on individuals, which is unlikely to work. And lots of people will end up having their data used without them really knowing that that's what's been going on. Ross has spoken a bit about the wider policy, and there's an awful lot going on, and it is part of a wider government move to monetize data sets for economic benefit and simple revenue. It is a significant problem, but I also think there's a problem with the way that Parliament thinks about privacy at this point. I don't think that government is really, and Parliament has really understood how it is that we avoid turning into a surveillance society. And we've seen a number of missteps happening. Perhaps The biggest myth that we all heard about is what has happened with internet records. Part of this is happening right at the moment, again, with something called data retention. The European Court, the Court of Justice, has ruled blanket retention of internet logs illegal for policing purposes. It says that you can do it on a targeted basis as long as you provide plenty of protection, things like court authorization. It's another thing that we've been demanding for years. And in fact, the Conservative Party and Liberal Democrats both pledged that this is how they would view the use of internet records before the election and agreed to it in the coalition. But right now, we've seen the government again rushing to ignore that judgment and to re-legislate data retention on a blanket basis. And we know that the front benches are discussing that right now. And I really deeply hope that that doesn't come to pass, and that hopefully 38 Degrees will get involved in that too. This is deeply worrying. It's often very unpopular. Courts are repeatedly asserting our rights to privacy and consent, but it doesn't get understood at policy level and in legislation. But we have to realise that privacy is not just some right on paper. You need privacy for things like autonomy. You want to make decisions yourself. You need to know when your data is being used and when you choose to be public and when you choose to be private. Free speech, in fact, relies on privacy all the time. Things like if you want to be a whistleblower, if you need to release data, you need to talk to a journalist, brief a journalist about something that's happened. You need your privacy at that point. You want to talk to a lawyer, you need your privacy at that point. You're worried about your health, you need the privacy of your medical data and the relationship you have with a doctor. If you take those things away or undermine them, you place all kinds of risks to make people feel unable to make the decisions that they need to make about themselves. And this data set and its use falls into that category. And lastly, I think we have to realise that privacy of information is about power. Data is knowledge, knowledge is power. Tax data, like any kind of data, can be used against you, could be used, as Ross has indicated, for profiling or perhaps insurance. These are risks that we need to be able to decide whether we accept them or not. Government should not be headlong pushing into the sale and reuse of data without everybody having a genuine choice about what happens to their data before it is used.
Thanks very much, Jim. David.
Thank you. As you've heard, I have opposed one or two government data initiatives, but this one is the first one that's actually made me angry, when I really do think it's a privatisation too far. And the first thing I'd say is I really don't think HMRC know what they're doing with it. They have vague and ambiguous purposes for what they're proposing. They haven't thought it through properly. They suffer from what I might call the big data illusion. If you have enough information about sufficient people, then you can answer all sorts of questions. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And of course, in this case, it's added to with commercial temptation that the Treasury will make money out of selling our data. And remember, it's our data. It's not theirs. It belongs to the government. It belongs to you. And indeed, actually, I mean, Ross has explained how easy it is to de-anonymise data. But it's even easier than he explained, because if you add other databases in as well, you can actually systematically identify hundreds of thousands of people, not just one or two. I also think the government has already, in effect, misused the law. In order to get to where we are now, they used the 2005 Act to define, I think at least three companies, Experian, Equifax and Dun & Bradstreet, as contractors for the government. And by defining them as contractors for the government, they're able to give them the information that we're talking about now in a semi-anonymised way. And that seems to be just wholly improper, dishonest and improper as an approach. Also improper is their justification. One of the claims you'll see in the white paper, the consultation white paper, is that we're doing this because it's a part of a G8 initiative. It doesn't mention it's a G8 initiative that we started. Neither does it mention that, of course, the G8 initiative will cover both America and Germany, both of whom have constitutional protection for the privacy of their citizens. So actually the Americans and the Germans could not do what is being talked about here. They could not sell it off. They are very, very strictly limited in how they can use your information. Now, these records have historically, tax records, and personal tax records, have historically been some of the most secret data in government outside the sort of spy type data. The reason for that is our predecessors 200 years ago knew how dangerous allowing access to this data could be. Ministers are not allowed to look at individual tax cases. Even Treasury ministers are in charge of taxes. And yet 200 years ago, when the most advanced technology was a card index and all your information was stored in paper files, we were given pretty much an absolute undertaking that no other department, no other part of the Treasury, no other part of the government, and certainly nobody outside would have access to this information. Now we collect the information by the gigabyte, we process it in milliseconds, and we can flash it around the world in an instant, and somehow we now think it's safe to put that data in the public domain, or effectively in the public domain, which strikes me as utterly dangerous and utterly ill-considered and ill-thought through. And I'll finish by agreeing with Ross, actually, about the publication of people's tax returns. It isn't wholly unknown. I think Iceland does it, Finland does it, Sweden does it, most of the Nordics, I think, one way or another. But if we want to do that, let's do that. Let's make it, let's have a debate about it, and let's say, okay, everybody's information will be in the public domain. The chancellors, the prime ministers, all the funders of political parties, everybody. And let's do it on a fair basis, and then we'll know what we're doing. There will be no illusion in this. There will be no accident about this. It's done properly. But if we aren't going to do it that way, then let's actually respect people's most closely held for private property, the information about themselves, and allow everybody to make their own choice about their own data. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Lots of food for thought there. So to throw it out to the floor, I'll take one question at a time, maybe to start off with. Caroline.
Caroline Rees from MP for Brighton Pavilion. Well, congratulations to 38 Degrees for mobilising so many people. That email was absolutely full of people saying get to this meeting, so congratulations for that. But I wanted to ask Jim a question, so I wasn't quite clear whether you were suggesting that what's proposed is allowable under existing legislation, or whether or not there would need to be some change in the law around data protection to allow this to happen. And secondly, if there are any criteria in place at all in terms of who is allowed to have this data, or would it simply be sold to the highest bidder?
So I don't think you can do it under existing data protection law, but I think the argument would be that because it is anonymised, that it wasn't really about you, and if it's anonymised and it's not really about you, then you don't have to ask the consent. It's kind of a slightly murky area of data protection, partly because we've bungled the way that we work data protection law in the UK. But I think there is certainly a lot of scope for challenging its legality. And then your second point was about who it gets sold to. I think at the moment we've been hearing about commercial access, so that would be essentially to the highest bidder.
Lady over there in pink.
Yeah, I'm saying thank you for building. Two points really. One, my friend had this stuff on the many numbers are here with the analysis of HMRC itself, so I don't actually have confidence that they will go into what's going on. And having heard about confidence still looking outside, I do think, I mean it's brilliant what you're doing, and I completely agree with David. I do think if there is going to be an ongoing campaign of this, you might need to make an interesting friends with some of the MPs, because 38 green card comes into an office and sometimes it doesn't have the best response. I came today because I'm leading a campaign. I heard with interest your views about the sustainable renewables. You're absolutely right. I don't know what Labour, Greens or any other party have got views on this, but I think we ought to get them all out there, take the politics out of this, and you can see it's quite a few Conservative members of Parliament here, and we're not happy. So we need to take politics out. That's quite interesting.
Anyone else want to take that?
Oh, sorry about that. One on the microphone. Sorry. really don't have HMRC vulnerabilities on it, and members of Parliament will. And secondly, some members of Parliament have quite a lot of negativity coming their way as a result of 38 degrees. And I would like the part of maybe the latest 38 degrees to say if they can take the politics out of this and say that this is a human rights issue really to protect our own data. It's not necessarily a party political thing. We need to know where all the parties stand on this.
Couldn't agree more that we need to know where all the parties stand on this, and I think every 38 degrees member in the room here today will agree that this is far from a party political campaign. And this is about human rights and our right to privacy for ourselves. I think many 38 degrees members believe in transparency, and I think that was something touched on earlier about transparency for everybody, especially for the government, and not just transparency for ourselves with our own data being out there.
If I could, I would just say, when the coalition took power, I think we were all very encouraged by the coalition agreement, and there were a lot of things in it which were very clearly going to improve the human rights situation, particularly on privacy, not least of which was removal of ID cards. And it was also the case that at the point where the coalition took power, the Labour government had a pretty appalling record on these things. So, although I'm not trying to make a political point here, I'm just saying no party is perfect, but certainly the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats have a lot to say in the way that they try to tackle these issues more broadly. That's not to say that the Conservatives and Liberal coalition's got everything right. It has managed to stop the Students' Charter. On the other hand, there's been other things going on that we've heard about which do disturb a lot of us. So on this particular issue, which is about use of people's information in a very public way, I don't think this is a party political issue even within the government. This is, as Ross has outlined, something that's been driven by some people, employees of the government within cabinet office, who've been hired on an agenda of open data, which is all, as we discussed, meant to be all about making the government accountable, which again is a hugely empowering and useful part of the coalition agreement and agenda. This was meant to be something where we knew about what government was doing, but it has been distorted, particularly by Tim Kelsey, but also other people as well, to being something about selling data. Well, it's data, let's make it more open. Any old data, more open. That's been the kind of push. There is obviously commercial value in looking at what individuals are doing and examining who's ill where, how much money is being spent in what particular postcode. But that doesn't mean that just because there's economic value to be got at, that makes it right, that you can just sell that without actually asking people. And then if you are going to even consider that kind of policy, it needs to be thought through at a government level. And the HMRC, in fact, has gone ahead even beyond the government's own processes here. They've done it before the Cabinet Office, for instance, have thought through how they are thinking about the same sorts of things that they're trying to push. So I think there's a lot to be said for everybody thinking about where they think privacy rights should lie, and for a lot of cross-party working at this point.
Yes, I agree. This is basically a yes minister story. This is the civil service doing what it wants, regardless of what the elected ministers said they would do, because they were too busy, because they were distracted, because they didn't pay attention to implementation, because lobbyists were noisy, because all the usual reasons that we've known for years and years and years.
Thank you. I had a question from the gentleman there, and then the gentleman here.
Thanks. A lot of people have written to me about this have been concerned that this proposal about selling personalised data about individuals to private companies in order for them, those individuals to be targeted and marketed to individuals. And that, I think, is an area of concern after the very different debate. Different debate from some of the other uses that might be used of anonymised data information. Sometimes get conflated. I think there are two separate sets of questions around first, is it safe, but also is it company-made safe, is it sometimes right? And within that, you might also draw a distinction between anonymised data used for social purposes and non-anonymised data used for commercial purposes. My question is, this 38 degrees, did you mean to imply what those people have inferred from your emails about or primary use of the data? And if the data can be made safe, do you believe it is always wrong? And in particular, I'm thinking of when the data can be used for progressive purposes, such as 38 degrees, and others will be familiar with the recent inheritance study, Equality of Opportunity, which was only possible by using IRS data, and has been questioned by also Barton and others, accepting a new direction in terms of inheritance, social policy, and race and segregation.
Thank you. Well, I think sort of on the question of is it safe, I'd throw that over to Ross. But to speak openly on behalf of 38 Degrees members in the room, as a group, we've campaigned before on care.data, and the clear signal coming from our members was that they were happy for data to be shared amongst public bodies if it was for the good of the delivery of the health service. But as soon as it comes into any kind of sharing with private companies, there was a feeling of unease about that as to how that would be used, and the question mark is all around how safe it is. And
Well, from the point of view of bona fide research, there isn't a problem at the moment. HMRC's got a microdata laboratory, and I, as an academic, can go there, sign the NDA, and provided I've got approval for the research project that I'm doing, I can use the data and I can come out with the statistics. That's not a problem. The issue is whether you also make this data available to potentially hundreds, thousands, or even more than thousands of private sector organisations around the world by claiming that it's anonymised when it probably isn't anonymised very thoroughly.
David, I'd like to answer that too. I mean, the first thing I would say is anonymisation is incredibly difficult. The most famous case, I think it's in Maryland, the governor of Maryland, wasn't it? One of the American states, anyway. Massachusetts. Whose data was supposedly anonymised in a public health database. The person who designed the anonymisation algorithms then exposed the governor because she changed her mind. An academic changed her mind about what was possible. And actually picked out the governor's data by just a few techniques. And this is relatively straightforward to do. It's much easier if you've got multiple databases. So anonymisation sounds great. It's really, really hard to get right. It may be impossible. It may be that data is either useful or anonymous, but it can never be both. That's the first problem to do with. Ditto aggregation. We've heard the saying about aggregated data, but you get the aggregation groups too small, that goes on too. So it's very, very, very hard to make it safe. And just remember, when we were in opposition and we fought the case over ID cards, what changed the public's mind? I'd love to tell you that the public went from 80% in favour of ID cards, which they were, to 60% against because of my rhetoric. I'm afraid it's not true. The reason was the government lost a couple of CDs with everybody's tax and benefit rates. So, and this can happen online too. It doesn't have to be on CD. So, the level of security and competence of the government is a real issue in this. But also, frankly, at issue is honesty. And the discussion over care.data, the government, or parts of the government, were not honest. And on this, I'm afraid, the government has not been that honest. And my concern is that selling aggregated or even anonymised data to major commercial concerns, the government will be tempted to sell to the high bidder. People will pay money. People pay money because it's valuable. And it's valuable because it enables them to perhaps fine-tune your credit rating or make yours higher and mine lower, or vice versa, or affect your insurance costs, and so on. So nobody's arguing here about public use of data in the sense of public bodies, or even bona fide licensed academic researchers. What we're talking about here is the commercial use of data, and there are thousands of risks, and very few, they're significant, but very few benefits. Care.data is a good example too. There are real benefits in care.data, but there are massive risks, and we can achieve the benefits without the sorts of risks that this sort of program is implying.
Damien was just keen to come back there and then...
Security and anonymisation are very, very different. But in principle, were it possible to overcome those hurdles, you do not object to the social use of big data sets and HMRC.
Oh, sorry, that out to the 38 degrees members in the audience. You do object?
Would it not be possible to make a data anonymised properly? The bounds recorded, there's bounds paradise. And secondly, David, you said talking about the identity chance, but wasn't you who persuaded me against it?
Right, I had the gentleman down the front here, and then Lady Brenda.
Frank Dave, ordinary person. I might sound a bit naive about this, but I don't think the protection or the certificate of technical matter at all. The principle is, does HMRC work for us, or is it a private company licensed to raise its own revenue and do what it was and use us as compulsory customers?
Thank you very much. Gentleman at the back there.
If HMRC or government agency, if I can describe them as that, have no responsibility to put out information that's open and correct, as opposed to misinformation, and if you're going to put out this information, you have to account for it in law.
Don't HMRC put out correct information and be accountable for that?
Well, technically, yes. Read the consultation document yourself, and you'll see that whilst I guess every word is technically correct, it's amazingly misleading. I mean, for example, they say they're doing this in order to meet the G8 requirements. They don't say that a few years ago it was us that proposed the G8 requirements, for example. And you can't stop that by law, I'm afraid. That happens.
Great, thank you. Oh.
I'm feeling I'm getting a little caricature. I'm delighted with the consensus that nobody trusts HMRC to get anything right. What I'm more worried about is that this department will have access to your bank account and be able to take your tax if you choose not to pay it. That is coming up next year, so I'm deeply worried about that. That's what we're concerned about.
Any other questions from the floor? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Margaret Blakey. I'm an MP for Taxpayers in Northern Ireland. And obviously we have particular issues in Northern Ireland on HMRC getting releasing of data, whether it is anonymised or not, because of issues to do with security and with safety of individuals. And for fear that that information may get into the wrong hands in relation to paramilitarism. So there is that particular fear. Because we already know that the have issues with certain information about cars through private car parking companies, and that has resulted in unsolicited mail and unsolicited financial penalties to certain individuals, which far outreaches that of government-owned car parking companies, and that has resulted in a lot of concern and distress. So we have particular concerns in Northern Ireland, and the constituents who contacted me have said that quite correctly. They're very worried about that.
I stood up, I wasn't really after applause, I really wanted a response. You know, is this going to be a private company now? Are we just going to be privatised every part of this house, which is Belgium? Is it all going to just be farmed off to private companies, or is it just going to be...
Question, David.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think Ross was closer to the target really when he said that this is as much a yes minister thing as anything else. A few years ago, Whitehall got seized with a great new fashionable idea of identity management. You know? I don't want them to manage my identity, actually, but that's the sort of thing. That's just a belief that if you've got so much data, you must be able to make some use of it. It's these sort of semi-plausible ideas that are driving this more than anything else. I don't think there's anybody evil or any evil intention about this. They're trying to say, it's no minister, yeah. They're trying to do the right thing, but they're getting it completely wrong. Simple as that.
Well, how can we stop?
We're doing it today.
Yeah.
This is a part of the process to stop.
This is real.
It will.
This is academic.
It will.
This is working.
Per.
Despite my accent, and my question is about the transatlantic free trade agreement and how that will encompass the trade in information that comes from our public institutions here into the private domain of commercial international sale and use of the data. And I think that introduces a whole new nightmare element into the equation, because once this is included in the transatlantic US-EU free trade agreement, there is no backing out. And so I want to be reassured that the TAFTA negotiations are part of that discussion, please.
Well, I'm afraid that DEF is already crossing the Atlantic without any further agreements. In fact, the so-called safe harbour agreements that are supposed to stop this happening are not in practice enforceable. And we found late last year that a subsidiary, an associate of BT, was already offering for sale in America the medical records of 50 million people in England. Right? So the American healthcare IT companies learned about it before you did. Now, no doubt exactly the same thing will happen to our financial data, because, as David said, the data has been handed to the large credit reference agencies such as Equifax, which are transnational America-based players, and they will presumably have it in the data centers in America.
Jim.
There's a specific problem with the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, around data protection. At the moment, we assert in Europe that we have data protection rights, and if people in the USA want to trade with us, then they have to respect those, and the way this is meant to work is something called safe harbour, where they agree to use our data protection norms. In practice, that's full of holes, because the Americans don't enforce safe harbour. People write that they're compliant with safe harbour into their privacy policies, and they're doing no such thing. And there's no examination of these companies to check that they are abiding to the agreements they make. So it is already pretty broken, and as Russell said, you can see some real-world examples of how broken our laws and arrangements with the state are. But what TTIP does is it commenting on a secret text in a secret negotiation which is ongoing. So, I'm talking about something where it's mere commentary about what is included and what isn't. It's very difficult to know precisely what is in this agreement. But what is clear is that both the European and the American negotiators are saying we must include data flows. This is the digital age, and we must make sure that European and American companies can trade with each other. And they have said that they want, therefore, arrangements for European data protection to be regarded as equivalent to the American arrangements for privacy and treating data, and that the signature be regarded as reasonable on both sides, basically. In America, there are no privacy rights when it comes to the use of your data. You forget it. The only thing that protects you is your contract, the terms and conditions that you click and sign. So basically what we're saying is that European data protection law should be regarded as equivalent to something which barely exists. So there's a deep, deep problem with that. And there's a second problem, which is this investor-state dispute resolution system, which would allow a company in the States that has invested in Europe that felt that data protection laws were getting in the way to say, excuse me, your supposed privacy rights in Europe are causing me to lose investment and income. So can you please get rid of it? And this is done in a private little tribunal in some hotel somewhere between three people who are experts in commercial law. So and then Europe or UK has to obey the decision. So there are some real problems with TTIP that go well beyond perhaps the purpose of this meeting, but without a doubt, it's a problem.
Comment from David on this,
Yeah,
and then to...
I mean, a past Foreign Secretary, Ernest Evans, who favors malapropism, once said, if you open that Pandora's box, there's no knowing what Trojan horses will jump out. And it was probably the best description of this state of being, because once this is opened up, really very, very difficult to see effective international law that will control it. So once it's out, it's out. And I think that's probably the right attitude to take to it. Just one aside on this. There are loads of other treaties about government data exchange, which people barely know about, which shuffle your data around the world. The Prüm Treaty allows your DNA data to be moved around and so on, all sorts of things like that. So once the data's out, you really you kiss it goodbye.
Thank you.
My name is Shion Wara, and I'm the Labour MP for Newcastle Texas, as well as being the Labour spokesperson for digital government and cyber security. And we're running a rather big review of digital government at the moment. And I do want to say that one point to make is that I find myself in rare agreement with David in saying that I truly believe that this is more cock-up than conspiracy, but it's nevertheless incredibly dangerous. In fact, it's possibly more dangerous from all that, because I think the other comparison to make is with the hacking scandal. You will possibly remember that 10 years ago people were debating whether it was actually illegal to listen to voicemails, there wasn't a clear legislative framework that people understood. And partly as a consequence of that, we ended up with this huge scandal. And I think we're in a similar position when it comes to data. There isn't a clear legislative framework. I was putting down, trying to stop the government putting in last-minute amendments to the deregulation bill to allow a data sharing gateway between HMRC and biz contractors. So they thought they needed primary legislation to do that there, but elsewhere they're simply sharing data on the basis of other agreements. So I think we need a really sort of root and branch view of what data ownership means in both the private and the public sector. So for the private sector, there's also really huge issues, so that we can have, control and understanding of what happens to our data in both those.
Now, we only have a few minutes left, and I see I've got two eager hands down at the end, but I'm determined for us to get out of the room in a more polite way than the people before us did. So if it can be very quick and concise for two hands at the back, and then I'm afraid we're... Oh, and this boy here. Then we'll end. Thank you. So I just take a couple more and then we can reply. And Justin there? Okay. Thank you. We'll address that at the end. And the gentleman here?
Hello. I would just like to say that being a parent is not nice. It really is. I mean, people put their entire lives on the internet, and then someone else can come along, see it, and then share it, put a video on the internet of live, share all people's stuff that they don't want to share. And also,
Thank you. And one last question over here, very quickly.
Everybody seems to get it right. Not have their information on something. Sorry, it's everybody's right to have their personal information not given out. So how come RNC can do it? Why isn't there a form given out and you can opt out and say you can use it, or like the electorate should know that they're not going to be given until you put across. It's like the opting out of the PDF file stuff or whatever on your computer. You want it to opt into if you want to, but otherwise we're not allowed you guys to do it.
So two questions there, one about the openness of this process from HMRC and the other about whether opting out could be an option.
Well, in answer to the first questioner, you've got an absolute right under European law to restrict your personal medical information to the team involved in your healthcare. The relevant precedent is I v Finland. Miss I was a nurse in Helsinki who was HIV positive. Her colleagues at work got to know of her status and hounded her out of her job because all clinicians could see all patients' data. She sued and she won. So as a European citizen, you have the right to opt out of medical data sharing. The government has ignored this for many years, and if you want to learn more, you should go to the website of medical privacy campaigners such as medconfidential.org who are trying to turn this right into a reality. The situation, as far as I'm aware, is slightly more vague with tax data, but it should not be. The lack of a decided precedent in the European court shouldn't make us all naked before the eyes, not just of the government, but of thousands of nosy parkers in the city and elsewhere.
And potentially we could end on the question around the openness of these proposals from HMRC, as asked by that gentleman and this gentleman here, around what the process has been so far, and what the where we're going with it. David?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll pick up all three questions. Firstly, HMRC campaign, certainly go for it, make their lives miserable. Secondly, why not told about this data? Well, just so you know, I mean, this looks at first sight rather technical. They have had a consultation document, to be fair to them, put all that out, but it does look rather technical, and you hear all sorts of warm words about anonymisation and so on. And when the extremely highly paid people at the top of HMRC don't understand anonymisation, what chance ordinary members of the public? I mean, it's hopeless. I mean, the simple truth is that when care.data was being considered, I didn't notice it until October of last year. I mean, I'm supposed to be a specialist in this area, but I didn't see it until then. So, yeah, they are quite, well, I'm not sure the right word is. I was going to say sneaky, that's the wrong word. But they are careful about not giving themselves too high a profile. Opt-out, can I just lastly deal with opt-out? Because we've had lots of arguments over care.data about opting out and opting in and so on.
We need to wrap up quickly.
All right, I worry about opt-out. It's very easy to have warm words, persuade lots of people that this is perfectly safe, and it goes wrong, and then it's irreversible. And that's why I worry about opt-out. The failure is irreversible and could harm you for your entire life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. I think we need to be polite and clear the room quickly for the next people. But thank you so much all for coming.
Because they are not only